Hi everyone and welcome to A Rhythm of Life. Today is Education Sunday, which is celebrated by churches together. Today we're very blessed to have a guest speaker with us called Barbara Easton, who has a leading role in the Methodist education. Her title is Heads of Service for the Methodist Academies and Schools Trust, and she's going to be speaking to us today. One of the passages that she talks about is from Exodus chapter 14, starting at verse 19. Then the angel of God, who'd been leading the people of Israel, moved to the rear of the camp. The pillar of cloud also moved from the front and stood behind them. The cloud settled between the Egyptian and Israelite camps. As darkness fell, the cloud turned to fire, lighting up the night. But the Egyptians and Israelites did not approach each other all night. Then Moses raised his hand over the sea, and the Lord opened up a path through the water with a strong east wind. The wind blew all that night, turned the seabed into dry land. So the people of Israel walked through the middle of the sea on dry ground, with walls of water on each side. Then the Egyptians, all of Pharaoh's horses, chariots and charioteers, chased them into the middle of the sea. But just before dawn, the Lord looked down on the Egyptian army from the pillar of fire and cloud, and he threw their forces into total confusion. He twisted their chariot wheels, making their chariots difficult to drive. "Let's get out of here, away from these Israelites," the Egyptians shouted. "The Lord is fighting for them against Egypt." When all the Israelites had reached the other side, the Lord said to Moses, "Raise your hand over the sea again. Then the waters will rush back and cover the Egyptians and their chariots and charioteers." So as the sun began to rise, Moses raised his hand over the sea, and the water rushed back into its usual place. The Egyptians tried to escape, but the Lord swept them into the sea. Then the waters returned and covered all the chariots and charioteers, the entire army of Pharaoh. Of all the Egyptians who had chased the Israelites into the sea, not a single one survived. But the people of Israel had walked through the middle of the sea on dry ground, as the waters stood up like a wall on both sides. That is how the Lord rescued Israel from the hand of the Egyptians that day. And the Israelites saw the bodies of the Egyptians washed up on the seashore. When the people of Israel saw the mighty power that the Lord had unleashed against the Egyptians, they were filled with awe before him. They put their faith in the Lord and in his servant Moses. I'm now going to hand over to Barbara Easton to talk to us her reflections on that passage, and I will see you again soon. Take care. God bless everyone. Bye.
Hello. The theme that we have for Education Sunday this year is a learning people in a time of change. How apt. Education and change very often go hand in hand. Learning generally leaves us in a different place from where we started. That's why Christians of all varieties mark Education Sunday and historically have often shared a belief in the importance of education. Learning at its best is empowering and transformational, values that Christians think are really important. It's one of the ways that the good news is lived as people move on to that greater fullness of life that God intends for all of us. And we certainly are in a time of change, what with COVID and now post-COVID, for individuals, for communities and for the church. And today I'm going to reflect on that a little bit in our three readings. First in Matthew, which reminds us that when people encountered Jesus, they related to him as a teacher. We know from the Gospels that when people called Jesus in the street, they generally shouted, "Rabbi, teacher." Matthew is writing maybe 50 years after Jesus died, but even for him, it's important to present Jesus to people as someone who is their teacher. He even regroups Jesus' teaching into 5 chunks, thought to echo the 5 books of the Torah, to show that here is a teacher par excellence, one who can even out Moses. When I was a teacher at the Chalk Face, I used to part company with Education Sunday sermons somewhere around this point, because they often go on to say something like, Jesus was the model teacher, and why can't we all be like him? Look, he's engaging, he's thought-provoking, he draws the crowds. Heck, he even walks on water. The point of today is not to make teachers feel inferior, worse, but to value education as a vocation within our Christian community. COVID has actually been quite a negative time for teachers in the media, so it's particularly important to say that this year. Thank you, people who work in learning with our young people in all your different roles and settings. And maybe as a church, you could find or think of a way to say thank you this week. Going back to Jesus, it's true that for the people who were drawn to him, what he was a teacher. And if that's the case, then it means that they who followed him were styling themselves somehow as learners. They wanted to learn. They believed that they had something to learn and that here was someone who could teach them. The word disciple actually means someone who follows a teacher as a pupil. And so that means that whether then or now to be disciples, to be followers of Jesus, is somehow to be that learning people. What might our learning look like? I've sometimes heard people say that Christians in the past were simple souls who just took what they were told, but that's not entirely the case. I've read of early Methodist miners, for example, who took their Greek New Testaments down the pit so that they could teach one another over their lunch. The internet has lots of definitions of learning which might apply to disciples. Gaining knowledge, improving skills, developing wisdom, social learning, and abstracting meaning. I particularly like that last one. How have you been a learning person in this time of great change? How has COVID been your teacher? I've learned to sew face masks. I can now make better cakes. I know my neighbours much better. All that's really good, but I think that there's still something more. A bigger question about how, as the people of God, we are abstracting meaning from this time and these experiences. What are we learning as disciples in this time about what it means to seek the way of God? What are we learning about being church? How will we be changed because of our learning in the post-pandemic world? The reading from the Hebrew scriptures is really interesting because it draws our attention to a community actually on the cusp of a new world. Our readings about the story of Moses have this week brought us to this pivotal moment where the people are leaving behind the only life that they've ever known, even if it was somewhat unsatisfactory, and are heading to the promised land. Apparently, the rabbis tell a story about how no one wanted to be the first one to step out in faith. Eventually, one person bravely stepped out and the waters parted. And the second rabbi says, well, he didn't so much step as fall, but still the waters parted. And the third rabbi says, no, he neither stepped nor fell, he was pushed, but still the waters parted. In our lives, change may come deliberately or accidentally. At some time or another, we probably fill each role in that story. We step, we fall, we're shoved into change. Today, we're thinking particularly of our young people. So we're thinking about those in education who are at a place of change on their learning journey. Sometimes we have to choose change in our journey and maybe find our inner brave. I'm thinking of refugees and people fleeing domestic violence, for example. Sometimes change chooses us, and we have to dig deep to handle the rerouting of our journey. I'm thinking of people coping with illness and loss at the moment. Sometimes change is someone else's fault, like in the story. And maybe coronavirus has got aspects of all three. Whatever, the story repeats, still the waters parted, change comes anyway. Pretty much the whole of the Bible is the story of people navigating change, a several thousand-year journey of travelling through uncertainty. What might we learn from the stories of God's people before us to support us in our journey, particularly as we think about moving on in our journey as a church, God's learning people in a time of change? I wonder if they thought that the sea would part and there, lying in front of them, would be the land of milk and honey. Of course, we know that they struggled to find their providential way. We know that they wandered in the desert for 40 years, doing a journey that Google Maps says should actually take 6 days on foot. We know that they lost the plot a few times. They went down false alleys, creating the religion they thought God ought to want, instead of remembering what they'd learned about what God actually wants. Remember the golden calf. They failed to recognize God's help when it landed in front of them. They called it, "Manna, what is this?" Perhaps we would like it if the COVID sea parted and we found the church of the future clearly laid out on the approaching shore. It's said that roughly every 500 years, the church undergoes transformational change. It's 500 years since the Reformation. Could this be the point where we see God calling us to do things differently? And if so, what? What are our golden calves? What is our manna? A couple of things leap out at me in this story, and one is that God is always there. If you remember, God promised that he would go before them on the journey as a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. In light and in darkness, God always there. It's a promise that we hear more than once on the winding quest of the Old Testament. A passage that really stays with me is Isaiah 30. God says it doesn't matter which way you actually go, whether you turn to the right or the left, I will go before you. And the psalmist talks about God everywhere, in the dark and the light. Whither can I flee from your presence? And again, the sense of God waiting for us in the future, in the lovely translation of the Message, you are already there. In this particular story, one thing that rather interests me is the behaviour of the pillar of cloud. At this particularly dark moment of the story, the pillar of cloud actually moves around to protect them. It puts itself between God's people and the danger that is coming, between them and the worst that could happen. It's a rather anthropomorphic image, but still I think it's a very suggestive image. There in the darkness, God. Between me and the darkness, God. The other thing is that Moses breaks through to the future using his staff. If you remember a couple of chapters ago when Moses protested, "How am I supposed to do this, God?" God said to him, "Well, what have you got in your hand?" A staff. In the culture of the time, not just a walking stick, but something more of a symbol of a person's authority and identity. God doesn't give him a new staff. Moses already has what he needs for the task. People might apply that to our personal journeys. I sometimes worry that that's a bit trite. But I wonder if there's some learning for it in the church as we move forward in the COVID and post-COVID world, that we have, to an extent, in our hand already the things that will serve us in the future. We carry them from our story so far. There's no new magic dust. Moses uses the resources that he has, his stick, his people, his friends, but in new ways. It's interesting how this has worked in lockdown, isn't it? My elderly friend's phone has become a prayer line. The computer is where I now go to church. But also people saying that they have seen anew the value of old-fashioned pastoral care and good neighbourliness. The question is, as we travel light into the future, what do we take with us in our saddlebags? One of our loveliest ecumenical hymns talks about bringing your tradition's richest store. Like many people in lockdown, we've done quite a lot of sorting out at home. And I discovered that my personal tradition's richest store turns out to be my husband's load of old tat. How do we discern beyond a simplistic, no, it's old, so it's useless, or a personal, well, this is what I like? Are there things in our saddlebags which shouldn't be there? Things which are harmful to others, maybe? We can see the challenge of the new played out in our reading from Romans, the life of the early church. If ever a group of people had the opportunity to invent the church from the ground up, it is surely them. And in fact, they did, and we read all about it in the early chapters of Acts. It's based in prayer and fellowship and learning and the breaking of bread. And yet, 30 years later, by the time that Paul writes to the church in Rome, they're arguing about religious rules and ritual practices that are a hangover from things that used to matter in the past. They want to replicate what they've known rather than learn from it. They want to copy the past rather than abstract meaning and live anew. They signed up to the new wine, but they can't manage to shape the new wineskins to go with it. Going forward into the future, God with us and before us. Can we? Here are some questions that you might like to think about in your own reflections. What are you learning as followers of Jesus in this time of the virus and beyond? How do you value learning and change in your life as a disciple? How does this balance with valuing tradition and the familiar? The pillar of cloud was for them then, but not for us now. How do you see God at work in the moment? How do you see God in your life or in your church or at work in the world? Where do you think we are being led by God into the future as a church? What do we have in our hand? And what do we have in our saddlebags? May God bless you as you go forward into this week and into this walk in his kingdom and in his presence, with him beside you and before you wherever you go.